Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Barry May, Chairman of the Richmond Society, and a warm welcome to our meeting, which is being recorded for our YouTube channel. If you don't want your image to appear in the recording, turn off your camera. And if you'd like to ask a question, use the chat function, and we'll come to it when the talk is finished. Until then, please mute so background noise does not intrude. Many of you are guests, so before I introduce our speaker, let me tell you about the Richmond Society. We love Richmond and we want to do whatever we can to preserve its special character and protect the environment, the beautiful open spaces and fine buildings. More than 1,000 people think it's a worthy cause. In fact, some of the Rolling Stones and other rock stars loved Richmond so much they made it their home. So if you think it's worth looking after, please join us. You can do so straight from our website. The night the Beatles met the Rolling Stones was on a Sunday evening in the spring of 1963. Our speaker, Andrew Humphreys, hadn't been born yet, but I had. There may be others here tonight who survived the 60s, even if they can't remember much about them. The story of the 60s and Richmond's role in those times is told in Andrew's new book, Raving upon Thames. It's about the jazz, rock and rhythm and blues scene that emerged in Richmond and across the river in Twickenham, and the birth of a youth revolution that changed the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Humphreys.
Hello. Good evening. I hope everybody can hear me. I am going to take you back exactly 59 years to the winter of 1963. Obviously, I wasn't there. I'm a mere toddler of 56 years of age. I wasn't born in 1963, but I imagine some of those who are viewing this evening would have been around. And 1963, 62, that winter, you may well remember it because it was the worst winter on record. Some parts of the UK were under snow for 10 weeks that winter. Over at Herne Bay in Kent, the sea was frozen up to a mile out. And in Windsor, the river froze over and you could drive over it. I just share my screen with you and hopefully you'll be able to see a picture of the bridge at Windsor. So 1963 winter, Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister, a man born when Queen Victoria was still on the throne. The British government was still smarting because the French President Charles de Gaulle had just vetoed the UK's entry into the European Economic Community. Kim Philby has just disappeared from Beirut to reappear in Moscow as a defector. Any of you that watched A Very British Scandal this Christmas on the BBC, well, the divorce proceedings between the Duke and Duchess of Argyll were being played out in early 1963. Had you been watching TV at that time, it would have been considerably less entertaining, maybe even more scandalous, because the top show at the time was the black and white minstrel show. If we zoom in tighter to the weekend of the 14th of April, 1963, which is the day of the events that I'm going to talk about. Had you been listening to the radio at that weekend, then undoubtedly you would have heard Jerry and the Pacemakers, How Do You Do It, sung by a former British rail worker. That had just hit #1. As you can see from that Saturday's Melody Maker, Jerry jumps to #1. Topping the album charts was Cliff Richard's with Summer Holiday. So,
Andrew, sorry to interrupt you. We can't see your screen.
You can't see my screen.
I can.
I can.
Oh.
I can't.
Okay, good.
I can't. I could until you said you were going to put it up and then it went.
Exactly, and it's the same for me.
Yeah, the same for
No, we can't see it either.
Oh,
We.
nor me.
I can't see it either.
Everyone.
I saw it briefly.
Yes.
That's
Got it.
That's it.
That's done it.
Yes.
Does it fill the screen?
Yes.
No, I can see you fine and I'm useless. I can see you fine and I'm absolutely useless.
Okay.
Yeah, we're okay now, Andrew.
All right. I will continue. I will continue. Okay.
It's not on slides, so it's a smaller version.
Okay. As long as you can see it. As long as you can see it. Okay. So where was I? Yeah. So Cliff Richard, Summer Holiday, top of the album charts. So 1963 still sounds a lot like the 1950s. However, 2 places lower in the charts and climbing fast is the debut album by the Beatles, Please Please Me. And in 3 weeks' time, that will hit #1, Elbow Cliff, Out of the Way, and it will stay at the #1 spot for 30 weeks, launching not just Beatlemania, but the whole youth-led revolution of optimism, creativity, and sexual freedom that we now refer to as the 60s. But that's in the future. That's months in the future. For now, Sunday, 14th of April, 1963, in Richmond, it's grey, cold, raining, and it's still a black and white world. That said, it hasn't dampened the enthusiasm of the crowds of young people who are queuing outside the Station Hotel, which is exactly opposite Richmond Station. It's now 1 Q Road, if you don't know it. Back then, it's the Station Hotel. And everybody's here to see the resident band who've been playing at the Station Hotel since late February, so for about 7 or 8 weeks now, and they're called the Rolling Stones. Rolling, they've yet to acquire their G. Everybody's talking about this new band in Richmond, and the audiences have been growing week by week. But this Sunday, it's particularly busy because just the previous day, the Saturday, there'd been a piece about the band, appeared in the Richmond and Twickenham Times. This piece was written by Barry May, chairman of the Richmond Society, a band that just introduced me. Barry May writes about the new rhythm and blues. Barry, if you didn't know, one of his many claims to fame is that he was the first person to ever write a review of the Rolling Stones, this review. A young reporter. And the photographs, I imagine, would be the first photographs to ever appear in print of the Rolling Stones. So the headline, Barry May writes about the new rhythm and blues, because rhythm and blues is new. So before Barry can get to talking about the Rolling Stones, he has to tell his reader what exactly the new rhythm and blues is. And the way that Barry describes it is pepped up blues and original American Negro pop music.
Oh.
And he explains how this rhythm and blues is taken over from jazz as the music that the kids are listening to. And he explains that the Rolling Stones play songs that were written by American blues artists, notably Bo Diddley, who he name checks. And it's a song by Bo Diddley that gives Sunday nights at the Station Hotel their name, the Crawdaddy Club. Crawdads, as I'm sure you know, are crayfish, caught and eaten down in Mississippi, where Bo Diddley comes from. And this is probably the first time also that the name Crawdaddy appears in print. And as Barry describes, the music the Stones play is exciting, and the way they play and the way they look is exciting. This is the Beatles. You check them out, matching suits, haircuts, shiny shoes, nice smiles, polite, maybe a little cheeky, but ultimately quite wholesome. They sing sweet songs like I Want to Hold Your Hand. This is the Rolling Stones. They wear ties and jackets, but they're undoubtedly a scruffy bunch. They look quite disdainful of the photographer. They are the boys from the back of the bike sheds who smoke and drink and sneer at passers-by. And they sing songs like, I Just Want to Make Love to You. As a band, they're raucous and they're edgy. And in a world of Jerry and the Pacemakers and Cliff Richard and the Black and White Minstrel Show and Harold Macmillan, nobody's ever seen or heard anything like them. So a few weeks after Barry's review, another journalist visited the Crawdaddy, and I want to read you how he described the scene that he found. He writes, in the half darkness, the guitars and the drums started to twang and bang, a pulsating rhythm and blues. Shoulder to shoulder on the floor stood 500 youngsters, some in black leather, some in sweaters. You could have boiled an egg in the atmosphere. They began to dance. They just stood as they were, their heads shook violently in what I can only describe as a paroxysm. Their feet stamped in tribal style. If they could, the dedicated occasionally put their hands above their heads and clapped in rhythm. In its fervor, it was like a revivalist meeting in America's deep south. This is Richmond, for God's sake. This photograph, I apologize for the quality, but this photograph captures the scene beautifully. You can feel the heat emanating from it. You can smell the spilled beer and sweaty armpits. It looks fantastic. However, as cool as the Rolling Stones were, they were still a bunch of unknowns playing somebody else's songs in the back room of a scruffy pub out in commuterland. While the Beatles, they're already well on their way to becoming the biggest entertainment story in Britain. So on that Sunday evening, 4th of April, 1963, as the Rolling Stones launch into their second set of the evening, and the bass player, Bill Wyman, looks up and sees 4 shadowy figures being ushered through the room, his jaw drops as he realizes, shit, it's the Beatles. Keith Richards sees them. Fuck me. So does Mick Jagger. Mick Jagger turns away. He can't even look at them. He's too embarrassed. Although both Keith and Mick do notice the long black leather overcoats the Beatles are wearing, floor-length leather coats that make them look like 4 gunslingers. And Mick thinks, whatever it takes, I'm going to get one of those. And from what I've been told, the people that I've interviewed, nobody that night bothered the Beatles. They stood there and they watched the whole of the second set, and the audience left them alone, which probably wouldn't happen these days. And I said word had got out about the Stones at the Crawdaddy, which meant anybody locally attending the art schools, in particular in the local area, who was a musician, interested in music, or was just part of the youth scene, they were down at the Crawdaddy because you had to check out this band. So in the audience on this night, 14th of April, as well as the Beatles, watching the Stones, was Eric Clapton. And we know this because he writes about it in his autobiography. Also in the audience were Chris Dreyer and Paul Samwell Smith, who in just a few months' time would form a band called the Yardbirds, a band that Eric Clapton would go on to join. So just think about that for a moment. In this back room of a pub in Richmond, you have the Rolling Stones, you have the Beatles, you have Eric Clapton, and you have half of the Yardbirds that we know of. Had there been a gas explosion that night and the place had gone up in flames, the 60s wouldn't have happened. We'd be living in a different world now. So once the gig was over, the Beatles, they stuck around the gear was loaded into the van, and the Beatles accompanied the Stones back to the flat where Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Brian Jones shared rooms. This was on Edith Grove in Fulham. By all accounts, it was a really grotty place, but then the Beatles were well used to that from their time in Hamburg. They sat up playing blues records from Brian Jones's collection and traded record collector talk, because they were all music fans. They loved the same music, which was basically old black American blues. They swapped stories, and without a doubt, Brian Jones would have pulled out Barry May's article and showed that article to the Beatles, because we know he was incredibly proud of the article, and for weeks after it was published, he carried it around folded in his pocket. And this myth that the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were bitter rivals, it's not true, certainly not at this early stage. Certainly they were rivals, but it was more a case of being friendly rivals. On this night, the 14th of April, they struck up a friendship. They had shared interests. And later that week, the Rolling Stones returned the compliment and went to see the Beatles perform at the Royal Albert Hall, where they were part of a prom put on and filmed by the BBC. A few weeks later, the Rolling Stones were recording demos on Denmark Street in Soho. Paul McCartney and John Lennon dropped by, and being the talented individuals they were, while the Stones were rehearsing, they knocked out the song, gave it to the Stones. The Stones recorded it. It was their first hit single, I Want to Be Your Man. Also, George Harrison did his bit. He put in a good word at Decca, which led to the Stones getting a recording deal. So, you know, there was a lot of warmth and friendship between the two bands. Maybe not necessarily between the fans, but the bands were on good terms. So it's a fascinating moment in musical history. It's the first encounter between the two biggest groups in the history of popular music. The question is, why Richmond? This is the question that fascinated me, and part of the reason I wrote my book. I mean, you could understand, had these people met in a nightclub off the King's Road, had they met in a recording studio in Soho, or in rehearsal rooms at the BBC, but in the back room of a pub in Richmond. How on earth did that happen? I've got a simple answer. 2 words: Giorgio Gamelski. And, oh, sorry, one photo before I move on to Giorgio. Just this photo that I found. I don't know how clear it is to you, the resolution's poor, but you can identify Mick Jagger stood to the right, then it's John Lennon, then figure unknown, then definitely George Harrison, possibly Paul McCartney with his back to us, not sure, but that's a very young Mick Jagger and a very young George Harrison. This was not at the Crawdaddy. I mean, it's far too smart to be the Crawdaddy. Could possibly be the Royal Albert Hall. What it definitely shows is one of the earliest meetings between the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. This is Giorgio Gamelski, handsome devil. Giorgio is one of the great forgotten figures of the 60s. He is an extraordinary character, and I don't understand why there are not multiple biographies of Giorgio, although possibly a biography could not do him justice. He kind of needs a great work of fiction because his story borders on the unbelievable. Unfortunately, at the moment, he's only got me to write about him, and this is what I write about him in my book. I'll just read a short section for you. Giorgio Gamelski was born on the 28th of February, 1934 in Tbilisi in Georgia, then part of the Soviet Union. Typically, where Giorgio's concerned, not everybody can agree on even this most basic fact. Giorgio's life is an accumulation of tall tales, improbable claims, and shrugged who knows. Some sources, including Giorgio's obituary in the New York Times, say that he was born aboard a ship as it sailed between Odessa and Genoa in Italy. And you want this to be true because it makes such a perfect beginning to the story of a man who spent his life in a state of perpetual restlessness. His father was a doctor, his mother a French-speaking milliner from Monte Carlo, and until the end of his life, Gomelsky spoke with an indeterminate Georgian, French, Italian accent that made him sound like some Central European count as played by Peter Ustinov. In 1938, the Gomelsky family fled the persecution of the professional classes being carried out by fellow Georgian Joseph Stalin. They traveled first to Syria, then Egypt, then Italy, before finally settling in Switzerland. Giorgio later claimed he became a jazz fan around the age of 10 or 11 after finding a stack of records in an attic and hearing tracks like Duke Ellington's Take the A Train and Louis Jordan's Ain't Nobody Here But His Chickens. He subsequently became hooked on the late night jazz programs broadcast on American Forces Network Radio. And with a group of friends, he founded a jazz appreciation society and formed a trio in which he played drums. When he was in his teens, his parents divorced, his mother left Switzerland, and she ended up in London. She sent a jazz-loving son copies of Melody Maker, which gave him a window onto the British music scene and a hipster's English vocabulary. Once his schooling was done, Giorgio joined his mother in London. This would be about 1955. He had an idea. He wanted to make a living by playing jazz or writing about it or making films about it or something. He made a memorable first impression. The first time I met Giorgio Gomelsky, says former PR man Greg Tesser, I thought I was in the presence of Grigory Rasputin. His hair was greasy and wild, and he waved his hands like some demented tic-tac man at the Derby. Pat Andrews, who was the mother of Brian Jones's first son, said Gomelsky was wonderful, so tall and exuberant, like he'd just stepped out of a Hollywood movie. But the impressions weren't always so favorable. Brian Auger, a musician who Gomelsky managed for a time, said he was a con man. So Giorgio washes up in London. One of the first things he did was he made his way to the offices of the National Jazz Foundation, which was on Soho Square in the West End. He wanted a way into the scene. He wanted to make films about jazz musicians. And at the National Jazz Federation, he met Chris Barber, who was heavily involved with running the NJF. And he met a guy called Harold Pendleton, who was the president of the NJF, which is quite an elevated term for an organization which probably only had half a dozen staff members. Harold and Chris had recently founded the Marquee Club on Oxford Street. I'm sure some of you know the Marquee Club, possibly went there. Giorgio did. He went to the Marquee regularly to watch jazz. Harold Pendleton and Chris Barber also founded the National Jazz and Blues Festival, which launched in August 1961 at the Athletic Association grounds in Richmond. So we're back in Richmond again. Why? Harold came from Southport in Lancashire, but now located in London and running the NJF. He gets himself a girlfriend who subsequently becomes his wife. This girlfriend, her name is Barbara. Barbara comes from Richmond. Barbara is the daughter of Richmond's chief fire officer, and Barbara lives in the family flat, which is above the fire station, which at this time was on Kew Road, very close to the roundabout with the A316. I think it's now a boys' school. So through his visits to the family home, Harold becomes aware of these great green spaces behind the fire station. And it occurs to him that these would be a fantastic place to hold a jazz festival, because Harold is passionate about jazz and is always looking for ways to promote it. And his idea is, if he holds a jazz festival, he can expose a far greater number of people to jazz than might come along to the Marquee. So this is exactly what he does. Harold, in his own way, was a great experimenter. And one of his other experiments was at this jazz club, the Marquee, he decides to put on some of these new artists playing rhythm and blues. This is back in early 1962 now. So we're still about 9 months away from the time that the Rolling Stones are in Richmond playing at the Crawdaddy Club. And it wasn't, R&B did not start at the Marquee. The Marquee was an early adopter, but the R&B in the UK actually started out in West London, not in Richmond or Twickenham, but in Ealing. There was a club, the Ealing Jazz Club, which was on Ealing Broadway. And here, two characters, Alexis Corner and Cyril Davis, started to put on a weekly rhythm and blues night. This was the first rhythm and blues club in the UK. This was a new music, blues music. And at the time, there were probably only a couple of hundred blues fans in the UK, but somehow the majority of them found their way to the Ealing Club. This was noticed by the Marquee, and the Marquee then gave Alexis and Cyril a weekly Thursday night residency at the Marquee, where they did really well. So well, in fact, that Alexis got a call from the BBC. The BBC said, "We would like you to come and do a live radio show." The only trouble was the show was on a Thursday night, which clashed with the Marquee residency. So Alexis Corner made a call to Brian Jones. Brian Jones from Chelmsford was a young, enthusiastic blues harmonica player and slide guitar. He would go to the Ealing Club as part of the audience, but the way it worked at the Ealing Club was Alexis and Cyril would do a first set with their band, and then for the second set, they would invite members of the audience to come up and jam with them. And Brian Jones was one of the guys who regularly got up and jammed and was obviously one of the most talented musicians. So Alexis said, "Can you put together a band and take over the Thursday night spot for this occasion when I can't make it?" Brian, of course, said yes. He called in two others from the Ealing Club audience, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards. He put a phone call into the Marquee. The Marquee did a weekly newsletter. So Brian calls the Marquee to tell them, "Hey, in a couple of weeks' time, we're stepping in for Alexis Corner. Can you write about it and give us a plug in the newsletter?" And the Marquee, it's Barbara Pendleton who answers the phone. The Marquee says, "Sure, what's the band's name?" At which point Brian goes quiet. They don't have a name. So, as the legend goes, Brian scrabbles around, picks up an album, Muddy Waters, flips it over, runs his finger down the track listing, comes up, Rolling Stones. We'll call the Rolling Stones. So Barbara Pendleton of Richmond is the very first person in the world to ever hear the name, the Rolling Stones, even before Keith Richards and Mick Jagger. So the Stones, they played their first gig at Harold Pendleton's Marquee in July 1962, and it's the Marquee where Giorgio sees them. Probably not on that first night, but they go on to play more gigs at the Marquee. And Giorgio has an eye for the future. He's an entrepreneur, he's a mover and shaker, and he sees the future of music as R&B, and he decides he wants to get in on this. What he decides to do is promote his own R&B evening. So he finds himself another venue, a club called the Piccadilly Club, which is down in Soho near Shaftesbury Avenue, and he puts on bands there. Harold gets wind of this. He's not particularly happy. But then what really gets his back up is he discovers that Giorgio is turning up at the Marquee on Thursday nights, and he's leafleting the audience to get them to come along to his club. Harold's furious about this. As is Barbara. I interviewed Barbara Pendleton just a couple of years ago. She's in her 80s now, and she still lives in Twickenham. She's still feisty, and she remembers the events surrounding Giorgio very clearly. She said he was a double-crossing little shit. So she's still furious about it, 60 years later. So the result was, to escape Barbara's wrath, Giorgio decides to get out of Soho. He has some friends who are in a jazz band, and they have a residency on Saturday nights at a pub. Of course, this pub is the Station Hotel in Richmond. Giorgio goes along to check it out. He already knows Richmond because he's been to Harold's jazz festivals. There've been 2 of them, and he's been there. He knows Richmond. And of course, the other thing about Richmond is it's far away from Soho, the Marquee, and the Pendletons. So in January 1963, Harold launches his Sunday night sessions at the Station Hotel. His first resident band is a band called the Dave Hunt R&B Band. Now, until very recently, the Dave Hunt Band had been a traditional jazz band, but like many bands, they've seen which way the wind's blowing. So they've ditched the saxophones and out with the trumpets and trombones. In comes the guitar, the electric bass. Interestingly, their new guitar player is a guy called Ray Davis. He'll only last a couple of weeks at the Station Hotel before he quits, joins his brother Dave in a band which they name the Kinks. Anyway, one Sunday in February, now if you remember, this is the worst winter on record. There's snow up to your armpits. Naturally, the Dave Hunt Band failed to turn up for the gig on a Sunday night. Giorgio sacks them. Instead, he brings in the Rolling Stones. They played their first gig at the Station Hotel on the 24th of February, 1963, to an audience of either 3 or 30 people, depending on whose account you read. And then 7 weeks later, and the audience, according to the reliable Barry, is topping 300. But the Stones are still Richmond's best kept secret. So how do the Beatles come to be there? And the answer again is Giorgio Gomelsky. Here we've got Giorgio on the right with Mick Jagger. So Giorgio is a born hustler, a man of ambition. He's running an R&B night with the Rolling Stones in Richmond, but he's not content. He wants more. Particularly, he still wants to get back into film. And he's got an idea for a project. He always claimed, and you take Giorgio's claims with a pinch of salt, but he always claimed that he saw the Beatles during a visit to Hamburg, back when the Beatles were unknown. And he always said that he followed their career right from day one. And he had an idea for a movie, which was to be a day in the life of the Beatles. As it happened, Giorgio knew Brian Epstein, and he managed to get a meeting with Brian and the Beatles, which took place on the afternoon of Sunday, the 14th of April, at Teddington Film Studios. The Beatles were there shooting an episode of Thank Your Lucky Stars, they shot several episodes. I don't know if this was the first. Anyway, Giorgio's there to meet them. While he's there, he takes the opportunity to upsell his band. He tells the Beatles that that night at the Station Hotel, the future of rock and roll, his new band, the Rolling Stones, are playing. And, you know, it's only a couple of miles away. It's on the way home. You should come, he said. And as we know, they did. This is the Rolling Stone at the Crawdaddy. This is the room that the Beatles would have walked into. So there you have the story of how the Rolling Stones and the Beatles came to meet for the first time in the back room of a pub in Richmond. But we won't stop there. You all know the story of the Beatles, but let's just talk a little bit more about the Rolling Stones, because their relationship with Richmond continues on for a little while yet. They continue to play the Crawdaddy that summer, but at one point they get kicked out of this place, the Station Hotel, because the pub owners are worried about their reputation. So the club relocates to the rugby clubhouse over at the athletics grounds, and this is facilitated by Harold Pendleton. So obviously he's no longer mad at Giorgio. The Stones also appear at Harold Pendleton's third National Jazz Festival that August. If you can make it out, you see Saturday, Sunday, the Stones are right down there, bottom of the bill, Sunday night. In fact, they weren't even on the main stage. They put them in a tent at the far back of the field, which backfired, because closing the festival that Sunday night was Bilk and his band. And as Bilk comes on, the announcer informs the crowd that the Rolling Stones will shortly be starting in the tent, and half the festival crowd abandons Bilk and rushes away to see the Stones. All of which would have been great had things not turned sour between Giorgio and the Stones. Giorgio has done a lot for the Stones. He's got them this regular gig at the Crawdaddy Club, when the Stones are actually at this point having a hard time finding gigs. They cannot get regular gigs. So for Giorgio to give them a Sunday night residency, it's incredibly valuable to them. Not only that, Giorgio has got them a Sunday afternoon gig at Ken Collier's Studio 51, which is just by Leicester Square Tube Station. What the Stones do is they play Studio 51 in the afternoon. They send their pianist Ian Stewart, who has a van packed with the equipment, off to drive to Richmond. They have a pint and a pie, and then they jump on the train and follow Ian to Richmond, where they play in the evening. Giorgio has also got them a Wednesday night residency at Eel Pie Island in Twickenham. So Giorgio has got the Stones 3 residencies. He's also paid for them to record some demos, and he's shot footage of them, which he's going to use to promote them. And of course, lest we forget, he's introduced them to the Beatles. The problem is the Rolling Stones are no longer Richmond's best kept secret. Word is out. The music biz in Soho knows about them. And one Sunday in June, a young man who is actually younger than the Stones himself, called Andrew Loog Oldham, turns up to see the Stones. Within a fortnight, he's become the Stones manager. Giorgio thought he was the manager, but he never got the Stones to sign any paper. Andrew Loog Oldham uses this loophole to sign up the Stones. Giorgio, at this point, he's back in Switzerland for his father's funeral. By the time he gets back to London, it's too late. He's lost the Stones. They continue to play the Crawdaddy. I mean, you know, Giorgio wants to keep his gig, it brings in the money, but Andrew Loog Oldham is now in charge. He gets the Rolling Stones a recording deal. He also gets them a spot on a tour supporting the Everly Brothers and their hero, Bo Diddley. And that's it. September, they're gone. Their residency at the Crawdaddy and the Eel Pie Island is finished. And the next time that they play anywhere near Richmond, it's in 2003 when they play their first gig at Twickenham Stadium. However, you know,
Still looking at that. Yeah. Okay. Have you finished?
Corner of southwest London that first nurtured the Rolling Stones. In just 9 months, in 1963, the committed fan could have seen the Rolling Stones play in Richmond and Twickenham 57 times. So what the Cavern was to the Beatles, the Crawdaddy was to the Stones. And this has been acknowledged by the Rolling Stones. In his autobiography, Life, one of the most startling revelations that Keith Richards makes is that he once kept a diary. And the entries end, he writes, at the exact moment when our future was assured, our getting a regular gig at the Crawdaddy Club in Richmond, from which everything sprinkled out. Fame in 6 weeks. Well, it wasn't 6 weeks, it was more like 6 months, but it was fast and it was in Richmond. Thank you. Back to you, Barry. Barry, are you there?
Unmute yourself, Barry. Unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to say, Andrew's description of Giorgio Gamelski is just as I remember him when I met him on that night, Sunday night in April '63. Andrew, thank you for reminding us what it was like in those days to be young, reckless, and blissfully unaware of the responsibilities that come with age. If we'd been able to meet in person tonight, you could have bought a copy of the book, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. But for the moment, are there questions for Andrew? Are there any in the chat? Let's have a look. Any questions for Andrew?
I have a comment or an addition, actually, if I may, Andrew.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
There were 6 times where the Rolling Stones actually played in December '62 and January 1963 at the Richmond and Putney Unitarian Church down in Ormond Road in Sandover Hall. And it's important in the history of the Stones because it's the first time the Stones played with a lineup that included Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts.
Is that the place in...
That is correct. I should say that is covered in the book. I didn't include it tonight because of time. I just thought, well, that's another rabbit hole to go down. So I just felt that I needed to keep the talk concise. But Paul is absolutely right. Before they did the residency at the Crawdaddy, they played 6 gigs at the Sandover Hall in Richmond, which was some of the earliest gigs that they played. And yes, this was the first time that the Rolling Stones appeared with Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts in the lineup. Yeah.
Okay, good. Any more questions for Andrew? I see nothing in the chat, but has anybody got one that you want to speak?
Yes, Andrew, did you interview any of the Rolling Stones or the Beatles?
I did not. I did not, and I'll tell you why I didn't. Because for them, the stories are so well rehearsed, and to be honest, their memory is so vague. I mean, you know, they really don't remember that much about that time, and everything they do remember was very well documented back in the late 60s and 70s in the interviews. So what I felt was, to get the true memories and the most accurate recollections, it wouldn't be worth talking to the Stones today in 2020, 2021. It would be much more fruitful to go back to the interviews that they did in the late 60s, where it was all so much fresher in their minds, and I would get a more accurate impression of their thoughts from back then.
There's a question here from, well, a statement rather, Judith, who says, "You never knew that Richmond used to be so cool."
Well, that's the whole point of the book. I mean, yes, my book, Raving upon Thames, the sort of, the title of the introduction is Carnaby Street, King's Road, Richmond upon Thames. My argument is that back in the early 60s, Richmond was cooler than Soho. Soho didn't have the Rolling Stones on a regular basis.
Oh, worry.
And here's another good one for these modern times. Where are the venues today for the new generation of musicians, or is it on social media?
Well, they've answered their own question. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't around in the 1960s to reap the benefits of the Richmond scene of the 60s, but I did come down to London in the 1980s. That's when I moved down here, and I moved down here specifically for the music scene. I talked about the Marquee earlier. I practically lived at the Marquee. I would go there at least once a week. And there were literally hundreds of gigs every night of the year. Yes, we've lost that. There is a music scene, but it's a completely different music scene now.
Right. And the Richmond Jazz Festival, which I do remember, and I do remember meeting Harold and Barbara Pendleton. The question is, how could the Richmond Jazz Festival be reinstated? If Cheltenham can do it, ... What do you think of the prospects of that, Andrew?
The Richmond Jazz Festival's still going. It's just not called that any longer. It eventually got kicked out of Richmond in 1965. The next door neighbour, the Royal Mid-Surrey Golf Course, got fed up of hippies sleeping in the bunkers. And they waged a campaign against the festival and got it removed. It moved to Windsor, and then Windsor kicked them out because of the noise. And for several years, they were peripatetic, moving around Surrey and Berkshire, I think. And they ended up in Reading in 1970, where they remain until today as the Reading Festival. And they are the world's longest running pop and rock festival. So it continues, but it has evolved. There's no way Richmond would allow a festival today.
And here's a question from Nick Coleman, who says, what about where Mick Jagger ended up living on Richmond Hill? And who else of rock note lived up there?
Well, there's an irony that I point out in my book. Throughout the 60s, you had lots of bands playing around Richmond at the Crawdaddy Club, at the Richmond Jazz and Blues Festivals, and of course at Eel Pie Island. And these bands got up the noses of the local gentry and residents who waged campaigns to get them out. And then by the time you get to the 1970s, the musicians in these bands are the local gentry. You know, Ronnie Wood has bought the Wick, and Keith Richards has moved in with him. Mick Jagger ends up on Richmond Hill. Pete Townsend is living on Twickenham Embankment. So yeah, all of these bands that have grown up playing in the area are suddenly earning massive amounts of money, and their accountants are telling them spend, spend, spend. So they all buy great big houses in Richmond and Twickenham by the river because it's beautiful and it's close enough and convenient to the clubs and studios and, dare I say it, dealers of central London.
Oh, here's another question. When did Billy Preston join the Stones, and did they ever play in the castle?
That was your question, wasn't it?
I'm thinking about the up on the hill. So Mick Jagger moved up there, and Charlie Watts moved in with Keith Richards up there in the Wick.
Well, no, Ronnie Wood owned the Wick, and there was a guest cottage at the bottom of the grounds, and Keith Richards moved into the guest cottage for a number of months. I'm not sure, I don't think Charlie Watts ever lived there. It was Keith Richards and Ronnie Wood that lived there. And then, of course, later on, after Ronnie sold the Wick, Ronnie also lived in Maids of Honor Road down on Richmond Green.
And Robert Smith wants to know what happened to Ian Stewart after he exited from the Stones.
Well, he still played with them, but he wasn't allowed to play on stage because when Andrew Loog Oldham took over, he reshaped the image of the Stones. This is what Giorgio hadn't done. I mean, Andrew Loog Oldham really saw what the Stones were about, and he saw their potential. And the first thing he did was he reshaped their image. He got rid of the jackets and the ties and played up the bad boy image. Ian Stewart didn't fit. He sacked Ian Stewart straight away. But Ian was one of the founders of the band, and he was a really great pianist. And so what happened was he was allowed to play on the records, but he wasn't allowed to appear on stage with them and appear in photographs. He acted as their manager, roadie, and studio pianist.
Yeah, he had quite a different image to the rest of the Stones. He just didn't look as cool as they did, I think.
Yeah, he didn't look the part.
Yeah. Robert Smith is asking, what surprised you most in your research for the book?
That Richmond turns out to be a real bohemian centre in the 60s. I moved to Richmond in 2007, knowing nothing of its musical or counterculture history. I'd been living in Soho, and I moved to Richmond because it was beautiful and rural, the river, the parks. And then I started to hear stories about the Rolling Stones and Eric Clapton and the Yardbirds and the goings on at Eel Pie Island. And so I started to dig deeper in the archives and interview people. And it turns out, yes, I mean, Richmond was a kind of Bohemia upon Thames in the 60s, particularly later on as the hippie scene really got going, because, you know, there was a certain strand of hippiness that wanted to get back to the earth, back to the garden. Well, Richmond was fantastic. So at one point, you know, the Garden Terrace and Richmond Park and the Riverside, you know, were full of hippie communes. Richmond had London's first dedicated drug squad because drugs were so rife in Richmond. Eel Pie Island had Europe's biggest squat and doss house. All of this happened in Richmond, which you wouldn't imagine to look at the place today.
Anybody else remember those times? Got any anecdotes to contribute?
I think a shout out should also be given to a couple of retail outlets down the bottom of Richmond Hill, namely Potter's Music Shop. Potter actually imported a lot of the blues from America, and on a Saturday you'd bump into the likes of Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. Eric Clapton was taking guitar lessons with Potter's. 2 doors away you had the Ivy Shop, which, you know, the likes of Rod Stewart and Paul Weller would be buying clothes. Post-war austerity meant that come the early 60s, you actually had money in your pocket. The youth became able to buy clothes. They were, so they wanted to make a name for themselves. Those 2 shops, 2 doors away from each other, 1 shop away from the Le Beige Coffee House. So within 3 or 4 shops, you had a nucleus there. And that's, you know, again, that's on the periphery of the Stones and the Beatles, etc., would have gone there. And the Wick on top of Richmond Hill, as Andrew says, was, as Ronnie Wood maintains, it was an open house for the top musicians in the world. You know, they all congregated there, they all used it, they all partied there. It's Only Rock and Roll But I Like It was written there. It's quite incredible.
L'Auberge crops up a lot in the book. You know, it was a great hangout for not just Richmond and Twickenham, but West London, where people would stream in to visit L'Auberge. Eric Clapton writes about hanging out at L'Auberge and playing his guitar there to attract girls. And then, you know, after making a coffee last 4 hours, walking across Richmond Bridge and heading down to Eel Pie Island. There was an incredible scene that the Crawdaddy was only one part of it. Again, that's the whole scene that's described in my book, is putting together Eel Pie Island, the Crawdaddy, the National Jazz and Blues Festival, L'Auberge, Potters, the Hanging Lamp, and making the connections not just between them, but how they related to Soho. You know, you had a stream of people that went backwards and forwards between Richmond and Soho, and even further afield. Every summer, there were a whole bunch of people from Richmond and L'Auberge that would go down to St. Ives in Cornwall, where there was a hippie scene started by the folk singer Donovan. So yeah, Richmond had this fantastic countercultural hub that was like the yin to Soho's yang, which is a story that's never been told, which is why I wrote the book. You know, it is the great unsung story of 60s London. I mean, a lot of you people who are attending tonight know about it because you were here. But outside of this area, it is a story that isn't greatly known. Everybody knows about the Cavern. Liverpool Council put so much money into, you know, maximising the Beatles' history in the Cavern. Richmond Council does nothing about our history and the Crawdaddy and Eel Pie Island. They ignore it.
And there's a question here, which is to me, and it's from Judith Nicholson. She says, can you say more about what you remember personally? All I would say is that I know that you, Andrew, have interviewed many sources for your book, and you've brought back so much of it to me tonight, because I think I've forgotten rather a lot of it. But you've described it very accurately, what it was like to be at the Station Hotel in those days, the original Crawdaddy Club. It really was very hot, sweaty, throbbing, an exciting place. There was nothing else like it. And it grew so much, and it eventually moved to the athletic ground just on the other side of the main road. It really was an exciting time. So I want to thank you myself for bringing back those memories. I remember the L'Auberge also, quite a den of iniquity at the time. Now, Andrew's book, I must tell you all that it runs to more than 300 pages. It's really worth buying. It's got dozens of images, photos, posters, newspapers and magazine clippings, period advertising, maps. There's a timeline, a bibliography, copious endnotes, and a full index. And I know it's comprehensive because I checked to see whether my name's there and it is. Bless you, thank you for that. You can get a copy of Raving upon Thames at any good bookshop for £20. If you're a Richmond Society member, it's only £17 at the Open Book in King Street, and it will be a copy signed by Andrew. Or you can buy it directly from the publisher, which is paradiseroad.co.uk. Now, if there are no more questions, let me wrap things up. Tell you that our next meeting of the Richmond Society is on Thursday, the 10th of February, when we will meet with Colin Cooper, who heads the local environment charity Habitats and Heritage. We hope to be back in Queen Charlotte Hall at the Adult Community College in Parkshot, so check our website nearer the time. And if you're not yet a member of the Richmond Society, join us. And in just a few clicks, you can do that at richmondsociety.org.uk. Until next month, good night, stay safe, and thank you very much for coming with us. And thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.